He knew what they were going to say before he even turned the key. Howard Jessup sat there a moment longer than usual, hands resting on the wheel, looking out over his land like a man who understood something he couldn't prove. The field was quiet. Nothing wrong with it. Same soil, same wind, same Oklahoma sky. But what he was about to do out there was going to set him apart from every other man in Kingfisher County, and he knew it. He started the tractor anyway. That was the spring of 1976, and if you've been anywhere near Kingfisher back then, you would have known exactly what kind of year it was. Wheat was high. Not just good. High. The kind of high that makes men borrow money they wouldn't normally borrow. The kind that makes them break new ground, push harder, go bigger. Banks were lending. Equipment was moving. Grain elevators were full before the harvest was even done. It felt like one of those stretches where you didn't have to be smart. You just had to not mess it up. Everybody planted wheat. Everybody. Except Howard Jessup. He drove that tractor straight out into the field and started planting sorghum. 200 acres of it. And if you don't farm, let me explain what that looked like to everyone else. It looked like a mistake. Not a small one. The kind of mistake people don't come back from easy. Sorghum wasn't a cash crop in 1976 Oklahoma. It wasn't some hidden opportunity. It was feed. It was what you planted when you couldn't make anything else work. It was what people quietly associated with men who had lost their edge. And Howard wasn't just planting a little of it to play safe. He was committing all of it. That's the part people couldn't wrap their heads around. Not a test. Not a hedge. All in. By the time word got around, it didn't take long for the talking to start. It always starts small. One man mentions it at the feed store. Another laughs. Someone says, "You hear about Howard?" And then it spreads. By Sunday, it's in the church parking lot. By Monday, it's at the coffee counter. By Tuesday, it's not even a question anymore. It's a conclusion. He's lost it. Now people don't always say things to your face right away. Not in a place like that. They let it build first. But eventually someone does. In this case, it was Virgil Tate. Virgil ran the John Deere dealership in town. Sold tractors, combines, anything with an engine and a loan attached to it. Good businessman. Knew what was moving and what wasn't. And that spring, everything was moving, especially weed equipment. So when he heard Howard was out there planting sorghum, he didn't quite believe it at first. Then he got in his truck and drove out to see it for himself. He pulled up along the edge of the field and just sat there a minute, watching the tractor go back and forth like nothing was wrong. When Howard finally stopped and climbed down, Virgil didn't waste time. "Why sorghum, Howard?" No small talk. No easing into it. Just straight to the point. Wheat's through the roof. Everybody's making money. And you're out here planting cattle feed? Howard didn't answer right away. He wiped his hands on his jeans, looked out over the field for a second, like he was measuring something in his head. Then he looked back at Virgil. "You want the short answer or the long one?" Virgil gave a dry half-smile. "I'll take any answer that makes sense." Howard nodded once. "Short answer is, my grandfather told me to." That hung in the air a second. Virgil stared at him like he was waiting for the rest of it. "Howard, your grandfather's been dead a long time." "I know. That was it." No explanation. No follow-up. Howard turned, climbed back on the tractor, and went right back to planting. Virgil stood there a moment longer, then shook his head, got back in his truck, and drove off. And just like that, it was settled. Not officially. Nobody votes on these things. But in a place like that, once a man does something that far outside what everyone else is doing, people decide what he is. And for the next 4 years, Howard Jessup had a name. Wrong crop Howard. They didn't even say it behind his back. They said it to his face. At the store. At church. Out by the road when they passed him. "How's that sorghum doing, Howard?" Not really asking. Just reminding him. The first year, it almost looked like they were right. We paid. Good prices. Strong yields. Men were upgrading equipment, talking about expanding. And Howard, he got by. That's about it. His sorghum didn't lose money, but it didn't make any either. Not compared to wheat. Not even close. That's when the tone shifted. First it was confusion. Then it turned into something else. Something quieter. Pity. That's worse, by the way. Being laughed at is one thing. Being looked at like you don't know any better. That sticks. And it doesn't just stay in the fields. It follows you home. It shows up at your dinner table without being invited. Howard had a wife, Dorothy. Good woman. Didn't complain much. But she heard things. Women talk the same way men do, just softer. She'd be standing there after church, talking to someone she'd known for years, and she'd catch that tone. "We just feel bad for you, Dorothy," said gently, like sympathy, but it lands the same. And then there was Tommy, their boy, old enough to understand, not old enough to ignore it. Kids don't filter things the way adults pretend to. They say it straight. "Your dad's an idiot." That's how it comes home. Not as farming strategy, not as economics, as something personal, something you carry. And here's the part that matters. Howard heard all of it. He wasn't some stubborn fool who didn't notice. He noticed every look, every comment, every little pause in a conversation when he walked up. He knew exactly what people thought of him. And still, the next spring, he planted sorghum again. Same land, same decision, no adjustment. That's when people stopped trying to understand it. After the second year, they weren't asking why anymore. They were just waiting to see how bad it would end. Because from the outside, that's what it looked like. A man doubling down on a mistake. And mistakes don't usually fix themselves in farming. Not over time. Not without a cost. By the third year, nobody laughed much. It wasn't funny anymore. It was just sad. That's the word people used when they weren't joking. Sad. Like watching someone go the wrong way and not turn around. But Howard didn't turn around. Fourth spring came, and he did the same thing again. Same crop, same fields, same quiet look in his eyes like he knew something nobody else did. And that's what bothered people the most. It wasn't just that he was different. It was that he wasn't unsure. He wasn't guessing. He wasn't experimenting. He was certain, and certainty, when it goes against everyone else, makes people uncomfortable. Because if he was right, then what did that make them? But nobody said that part out loud. Not yet. Not until the weather started to change. It wasn't a sudden thing. That's what people always get wrong when they look back later. They think the moment a man makes a decision like that, there must have been something dramatic, something obvious, something that made it all clear. It wasn't like that. There was no sign in the sky, no warning anyone else could see. Just a winter storm and a man stuck in his own attic with more time than he expected. That was February of 1976, a few weeks before he planted that first field. The storm had come through hard enough to shake loose part of the old farmhouse roof, and Howard had gone up there to check for leaks. He'd lived in that house 15 years by then. Same house his father had lived in. Same one his grandfather had built before that. And in all those years, he'd never bothered with the old trunk sitting in the corner of the attic. He knew it was there. Everybody did. One of those things that just becomes part of house. You walk past it enough times, it stops existing. But that day, with the wind pushing against the boards and nothing else demanding his time for once, he opened it. Not because he expected anything, just because it was there. Inside were the usual things you'd expect from a life already lived. Old photographs, edges worn soft. A watch that didn't run anymore. A Bible with names written inside the cover in handwriting that belonged to another time. And at the bottom, wrapped tight in oilcloth like someone had cared enough to make sure it lasted, there was a leather-bound journal. His grandfather's, Elmer Jessup. Howard didn't know much about him beyond the basics. He died before Howard was old enough to remember anything clearly. But he knew this much. Elmer had farmed that same land when things weren't easy. Not just the usual ups and downs. Worse than that. The kind of years people don't like to talk about because there's nothing good to say. Howard sat down right there in the attic, dust in the air, cold coming through the roof, and started reading. At first it was just notes. Planting dates. Yields. Weather patterns. Nothing that would have mattered much on its own. But then the entries changed. The tone shifted. The years he was reading about weren't normal years. Early 1930s. Dry seasons stacking one on top of the other. Heat that didn't break. Crops that didn't come up the way they should. And then worse. Wind. Not the kind that passes through. The kind that stays. The kind that takes things with it. Soil first. Then hope. Elmer wrote it down plain. Wheat failed. Then failed again. Then again. Year after year. No guessing. No soft language. Just facts. What worked? What didn't? What cost him money? What nearly cost him everything? And then one entry stood out. Not longer than the others. Not written any differently. But it changed the direction of everything that came after it. 1936, the worst of it. The year most men had already given up or were thinking about it. And Elmer wrote about trying something different. Sorghum, not because it was profitable, not because it was popular, because it could survive. Deep roots, needed less water, didn't promise much, but it promised something. That year, while wheat failed across the county, his sorghum didn't. It wasn't a big win. It wasn't the kind of year you brag about, but it was enough. Enough to keep going. Enough to not leave. Enough to stay on land other men were walking away from. Howard kept reading, page after page. Not a story, not something written for anyone else, just a record of what a man had learned the hard way. And then at the end, there was a section that wasn't like the rest. No numbers, no dates, just a few lines written slower, like they mattered more than everything before them. The drought will come again. It always does. Maybe not next year, maybe not for a long time, but it will come. And when it does, wheat will fail first. It always does. If you wait until then to change, you're already too late. Plant sorghum before the drought comes, not after. Howard sat there a long time after reading that. Longer than he expected. Long enough that the cold started to settle in his hands. It wasn't the kind of thing you could prove. That was the problem. There was no chart, no forecast, nothing he could take down to the feed store and lay on the counter and say, here's why. All he had was the words of a man who had already been through something worse than anything he'd seen himself. A man who had paid for that knowledge with years most people didn't survive in one place, and then wrote it down so someone else wouldn't have to learn it the same way. That night, he showed it to Dorothy. Sat at the kitchen table, same place they'd eaten every meal for years, and read parts of it out loud. Not all of it, just enough. She listened, didn't interrupt, didn't argue. When he finished, she asked the only question that mattered. You think it's going to happen again? Howard didn't answer right away. He looked down at the pages, ran his thumb along the edge like he was feeling the years in it. I don't know when, he said, but I think he believed it would. That was enough for him. Not proof, not certainty, just enough. That's the part most people don't understand when they hear this story. They think he knew. He didn't. He made a choice without knowing. That's what made it a risk. That's what made it cost something. Because once he stepped out into that field that spring, there was no halfway version of it. He couldn't plan a little and see how it went. That wouldn't have protected him if the journal was right. It had to be all of it. 200 acres. Everything he had, and everything that came with it. Reputation, trust, stability. The way people looked at him when he walked into a room. He traded all of that for something he couldn't prove and couldn't explain in a way anyone else would accept. And once he made that decision, he didn't talk about it much again. Not because he was hiding it, because he knew it wouldn't matter. People don't listen to warnings about things they haven't felt yet. His grandfather had written that too, just not in those words. You could see it between the lines. Men don't believe in drought when their fields are green. So Howard didn't try to convince anyone. He didn't argue at the store, didn't bring the journal to church, didn't try to explain himself to Virgil the next time they crossed paths. He just kept planting. Year 1, year 2, year 3, year 4, same decision, same quiet certainty. And every year that nothing happened, every year the rain came close enough, every year wheat paid and sorghum didn't, the gap between what he believed and what everyone else saw got wider. Because now it wasn't just different. It was wrong, repeatedly wrong. And that does something to a man if he's not careful. It makes him question the one thing he's holding on to. There were nights he woke up before the sun, sat at the edge of the bed, and thought about it. Thought about switching back. Thought about how easy it would be to just do what everyone else was doing and let the whole thing go. Nobody would remember after a while. People forget fast when you fall back in line. But then he'd think about those pages. About a man writing by hand what it cost him to learn those lessons. And the part that stayed with him wasn't even the warning. It was the timing. Before, not after. That word mattered. Because after is when everyone believes. After is when it's obvious. After is when it's already too late to matter. And that was the line he couldn't cross. Not once he understood it. So he stayed with it. Through the looks. Through the comments. Through the years that made it seem like he'd been wrong from the start. And by the time the weather started to shift, by the time the first real signs showed up in a way people couldn't ignore anymore, Howard Jessup had already made his decision 4 times in a row. He didn't have to think about it anymore. He'd already paid for it. By the time the 3rd year came around, nobody was asking him why anymore. That part was over. People had already made up their minds about Howard Jessup, and once a place like Kingfisher County decides who you are, it doesn't revisit that decision often. He wasn't the guy trying something different anymore. He was the example, the cautionary tale, the name people used when they wanted to make a point without saying it directly. Don't end up like Howard. And the thing is, it wasn't loud. That's what made it harder. Nobody stood in front of him and argued it out. Nobody tried to prove him wrong anymore. They just moved on without him. That kind of silence says more than words ever could. First year, they laughed. Second year, they shook their heads. Third year, they stopped expecting anything from him at all. And that's where it gets heavy. Because when people stop arguing with you, it means they've already written the ending in their minds. Spring of 1978, he planted sorghum again. Same rows, same pace, same look on his face like he wasn't waiting for permission. By then, even Virgil didn't drive out anymore. There was nothing left to say. You don't go talk sense into a man who's already made the same choice 3 times in a row. At the feed store, conversations would shift when he walked in. Not obvious. Not enough that you could call it out. Just enough that you'd notice if you were paying attention. And Howard was paying attention. He'd walk up, grab what he needed, stand there a second longer than necessary, just long enough to hear the tale into something that wasn't meant for him. Then would stop. Someone would change the subject. Someone else would ask about the weather like that was what they'd been talking about all along. And he'd nod, pay, and leave. That kind of thing doesn't break a man all at once. It works on him slow, day by day, look by look, and it doesn't stay outside. It follows him home. One afternoon, Tommy came through the door a little quieter than usual. Didn't say much, just dropped his bag and went straight to the table. Dorothy noticed it first. She always did. "What happened?" she asked. Tommy shrugged. "Nothing. But kids don't hide things well. Not from their parents. Not when it matters." It took a minute, but it came out. A boy at school had said it. Said his dad was going to lose the farm. Said everybody knew it. Said Howard Jessup didn't know what he was doing. It didn't turn into a fight right away. That's not how these things usually go. It builds. One word, then another. Then a shove. Then it's done. Tommy had a mark on his face. Not bad, but enough. Enough that it made it real. Dorothy looked at Howard like she was waiting for him to say something that would make it better. Something strong. Something certain. But he didn't. Not right away. He just sat there, hands on the table, looking at his son like he was weighing something heavier than a single moment. Then he stood up, walked over to the cabinet, and pulled out the journal. Brought it back, set it down in front of Tommy, and opened it. "Sit," he said. No anger. No raised voice. Just steady. Tommy sat, and for the next hour, Howard read. Not all of it. Just the parts that mattered. The years that failed. The crops that didn't come in. The way things fell apart for men who thought they had time to adjust. He explained it as he went, not like a lecture, but like something that had to be understood if it was going to mean anything. Tommy listened, didn't interrupt, just sat there, eyes moving between the pages and his father's face. When Howard finished, there was a long pause. Then Tommy asked the question that had been sitting there the whole time. What if he was wrong? Simple question. Honest. The kind that doesn't leave room to hide. Howard leaned back in his chair a little, looked down at the journal, then back at his son. "Then I'm wrong," he said. Just like that. No hositashchen. No trying to soften it. "Then I've been wrong this whole time." Tommy swallowed. "And we lose." Another pause. Not long, but long enough that you could feel the weight of it. "Maybe," Howard said. Then he leaned forward again, tapped the page lightly with his finger. "But if he's right, and I wait until everyone else sees it, then we don't get a second chance." That's the part that stuck. Not the fear. Not the risk. The timing. Before or after. That's what separated what he was doing from what everyone else was doing. Everyone else was waiting for proof. Waiting for something they could see, something they could point to, something they could agree on together. Howard had already crossed that line. And once you cross it, you don't get to come back and pretend you didn't. Spring turned into summer. Summer into harvest. And just like the years before it, wheat paid. Not perfectly. Not record-breaking every time. But enough. Enough that men stayed confident. Enough that nobody had a reason to question what they were doing. And every time that happened, every time the rain came just enough, every time the crops came in strong enough, it pushed Howard further out on his own. Because now it wasn't just that he was different. It was that he kept being wrong in real time. That's a hard place to stand. Most men don't stay there long. They adjust. They compromise. They come back just enough to not look like they've lost their footing. Howard didn't. Fourth spring came. 1979. He planted sorghum again. By then, people didn't even react much. Not out loud. It had gone past that. It had turned into something quieter. Resigned. Like watching something play out that you already know the ending to. Some people stopped mentioning it altogether. Others still used his name, but not with humor anymore. More like a warning you didn't need to explain. Don't go full Howard. That was enough. And through all of it, Howard kept moving the same way he always had. Same hours, same routine, same steady pace across those fields like the outside noise didn't change what needed to be done. But it did change something, not on what he did, and how it felt. There's a difference between being alone and being set apart. Alone is quiet. Set apart is loud in a way that never stops. It's in every conversation you're not part of. Every look that lingers a second too long. Every moment you walk into a room and feel like you've already been discussed before you got there. And the longer it goes on, the harder it gets to separate what you know from what everyone else keeps showing you. There were nights he lay awake longer than he'd admit. Not doubting the journal. Not exactly, but questioning the cost. Questioning how long a man could stand against something like that without it changing him. Without it wearing him down enough to make him second-guess even the things he believed most. But every time it came back to the same place. The same word. Before. Not after. He didn't say it out loud. Didn't need to. It was already settled. And then the weather started to feel different. Not wrong. Not enough that anyone could point to it and say something had changed. Just off. The kind of winter that didn't quite deliver what it usually did. Snow came light. Didn't stick the way it should. Ground didn't hold moisture the way it normally would going into spring. Most people didn't think much of it. Weather shifts all the time. One season doesn't mean anything by itself. But Howard noticed. Not in a way he could explain. Just in the way a man notices something he's been told to watch for. Spring came thinner than usual. Rain showed up late. Not missing. Just late enough that it made planting feel a little tighter than it should. Conversations at the feed store changed tone just a little. Not worry. Not yet. Just attention. More talk about forecasts. More checking the sky than usual. By May, people were watching their field a little closer. By June, they were talking about it out loud. Still not panic. Still not anything that broke confidence. But the certainty that had carried through the last 4 years started to soften. And Howard Jessup walked out into his fields, looked across rows of sorghum that were doing exactly what they were supposed to do. And for the first time in a long while, the distance between what he believed and what everyone else saw started to close. It didn't happen all at once. No storm. No single day where everything changed and everyone suddenly understood. It came in quietly, the way most bad years do. One week a little hotter than it should have been. One stretch of sky that stayed clear too long. Then another. By early summer of 1980, the ground had started to tell the truth before the men were ready to say it out loud. Wheat was the first to show it. Leaves lost their color. Not all at once. Just enough that if you walked a field and knew what you were looking at, you'd feel it in your stomach before you could explain it. The heads didn't fill the way they should. Stalks didn't hold the same strength. It wasn't failure yet, but it wasn't right. And farmers notice, not right, faster than anything. At the feed store, the conversations changed. No more talk about expansion. No more talk about buying new equipment. It shifted to questions. You getting enough rain out your way? You think this heat's gonna break? Nobody said the word drought. Not yet. That word carries weight. People don't use it early. They wait. They hope it corrects itself before they have to name it. By June, hope started thinning out. Days stacked up over 100 degrees. No clouds. No relief. Fields that should have been moving forward just stalled. You could walk through a wheat field and hear it under your boots. Dry. Brittle. Not dead, but not alive the way it needed to be. And still, most men held on to what they knew. It's just a rough patch. It'll turn. It always turns. That's how it had been for years. That's what they were used to. Howard didn't say much. He watched. Same way he had been watching since that winter in the attic. Same way his grandfather had written about watching signs most men didn't take seriously until they had no choice left. One afternoon, he drove out past his own fields and onto the county roads. Not for any real reason, just to see, to look. Field after field of wheat stretched out, and everywhere he looked, he saw the same thing. Color fading, growth slowing, heads not filling. Some fields worse than others, but none of them right. He didn't stay long. Didn't need to. He turned the truck around and drove back home. Walked out to his own land. Stood at the edge of it for a while. His sorghum wasn't perfect. You could see the stress in it. Leaves curled tighter than they should. Growth slower than a good year. But it was standing. It was alive. That was the difference. Not thriving. Not winning. Just surviving. And in a year like that, surviving was enough. Dorothy found him out there later that evening. He hadn't moved much. Just stood there, looking across those rows like he was seeing something he'd been waiting on for a long time. She didn't say anything at first, just stood beside him. After a while, he spoke. Quiet, almost to himself. He was right. That was it. No explanation needed. She knew what he meant. Everyone did, even if they hadn't read the journal. By July, nobody was avoiding the word anymore. It wasn't a question. It wasn't a possibility. It was happening. The county was in a drought. And once it's real, everything speeds up. Wheat that had been holding on started to fail outright. Fields that should have been full and heavy going into harvest stood thin and empty. Some didn't even make it that far. Stocks gave out before they could produce anything worth taking in. Grain elevators that should have been running steady through the season went quiet. Too quiet. That's something people remember. Not just the loss, the silence. Places that were supposed to be busy weren't. Men started driving past each other slower, stopping more often, talking in shorter sentences. Nobody had answers. There aren't many conversations left when a crop fails like that. Numbers got smaller, then smaller again. What used to be thousands of bushels turned into hundreds. In some cases, nothing at all. And then Howard Jessup pulled in with his sorghum. Glenn Mueller, who ran the grain elevator, stepped out when he saw the truck. Not in a hurry, just curious. He looked at the load, looked at Howard, then back at the grain. Sorghum, he said, almost like he was reminding himself what he was looking at. Howard nodded. Glenn let out a slow breath, then shook his head once. Not in disbelief. Something closer to respect. Well, I'll be. He didn't finish the sentence. Didn't need to. Numbers don't lie. While the county's wheat crop had dropped off hard, Howard had something to bring in. Not a miracle. Not untouched. But real. Enough to sell. And that's when the second shift happened. Because now it wasn't about being right or wrong in theory. It was about results. Feedlots down in Texas were hurting too. Hay had failed along with everything else. They needed feed. Sorghum prices moved. Fust would have been barely worth talking about a few years earlier suddenly mattered. A lot. Howard's harvest came in at around 6,000 bushels. At prices climbing past $3 a bushel. That turned into close to $20,000. In a year, when some men didn't make anything at all. Think about that for a second. Same county, same weather, same year. One man had something to sell. Most had nothing. That's not a small difference. That's everything. Word spread the way it always does. Fast. Faster than the drought had, in some ways. Howard was right. That's what people said now. Not quietly. Not behind his back. Out loud. The same places that had used his name as a warning started using it differently. Same words, different meaning. Wrong crop Howard. But now it sounded different. Not like a joke anymore. Like something people hadn't understood when they first said it. Virgil Tate came back out to the farm. Didn't call ahead. Just drove up the same way he had 4 years earlier. This time he didn't stand at the edge of the field as long. He walked straight over. Howard shut the tractor down and climbed down. They stood there a moment. No ruse. Virgil looked out over the sorghum, then back at Howard. You knew? He asked. Not accusing, not challenging, just trying to understand. Howard shook his head. No. Simple answer. Honest. Virgil frowned a little. Then how? Howard shrugged once, not dismissive, just matter of fact. I listened. That sat there between them. And for the first time in 4 years, Virgil didn't have anything to say back. He just nodded. Slow. Like he was accepting something he hadn't wanted to before. But the story doesn't stop at being right. That's where most people think it ends. Man makes a strange decision, gets laughed at, turns out he was right all along. That's not the whole thing, because what happened next mattered just as much. Maybe more. The drought didn't break. Not that year. Not the next. If 1980 woke people up, 1981 forced them to face it. No snow that winter. Almost no rain that spring. By early summer, it wasn't just a bad year anymore. It was the kind of stretch that starts taking things from people they don't get back. Some farmers tried to switch. Couldn't blame them. They'd seen what happened. They wanted to do what Howard had done. But timing matters. That was the whole point. Seeds weren't easy to get. Equipment wasn't set up for it. Knowledge wasn't there. You don't learn a new crop in the middle of a drought and expect it to save you. Some tried anyway. Results weren't good. Most stayed with wheat. Not because they thought it would work. Because it was all they knew. And that's another kind of trap. Meanwhile, Howard planted sorghum again. Same as before. This time nobody laughed. Nobody questioned it. That part was over. Now, they were watching. Learning. Too late for some of them. His yield dropped some that year. The drought was deeper now. Harder on everything. But he still brought in around 4,000 bushels. Prices climbed even higher. Close to $4. Another solid year. While around him, things were coming apart. That's when the foreclosures started. Quiet at first. Then more often. Then all at once. Farms that had been in families for generations changed hands in an afternoon. Paperwork instead of harvest. Dale Watkins lost his place north of town. The Mitchell brothers couldn't hold on after expanding too fast during the good years. Land went back to the bank. Equipment got taken. And Virgil's lot filled up again. But not with new machines. Repossessed ones. Tractors that had left clean and came back used. Nobody buying. Nobody expanding anymore. That's what a real downer looks like. Not noise. Not panic. Just things stopping. And Howard watched it happen. Not from a distance. These were his neighbors. People he'd known his whole life. Men he'd worked alongside. Helped. Talked with. And standing there, in a position where he had done well while they had lost everything, there wasn't much satisfaction in it. Not the kind people expect. Mostly just a quiet understanding of what it cost to be early. And what it cost to be late. By the spring of 1982, things had settled into a new kind of reality. Not better, just clearer. The kind of clear that comes after something is already broken and there's no putting it back the way it was. Farms had changed hands. Some men were gone. Not dead, but gone from the land their families had worked for decades. Moved away, took jobs they never thought they'd have to take. Started over somewhere else because there wasn't anything left to hold on to. And the ones who stayed, they weren't the same either. You could see in how they talked, how they looked at their fields, how careful they were with decisions they used to make without thinking. Hard years do that. They take the guesswork out of things. Around that time, Howard drove into town and stopped by Virgil Tate's dealership. It wasn't the same place it had been a few years earlier. The lot was full, but not in a good way. Machines sitting there too long. Dust settling on things that were meant to move. Virgil was inside, going through papers when Howard walked in. He looked up, managed a small smile. Howard, not much behind it. Just recognition. Howard nodded, took a seat across from him without making a big deal out of it. They sat there a second. No ruse. That was something both men understood by then. Howard reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded bank statement, set it down on the desk, and slid it across. Virgil looked at it, then looked again. Numbers like that don't get mistaken. $62,000. 3 years of sorghum. 3 years of being wrong in everyone else's eyes. Virgil leaned back a little, let out a slow breath. That'll buy a lot of land right now, he said. Howard nodded once. That's the idea. He didn't dress it up. Didn't pretend it was anything else. There was land available. Good land. Land that had been forced out of the hands of people who couldn't hold it through the drought. And Howard had the cash to step in. Watkins' place is up, Virgil said. Bank's looking to move it. Howard nodded again. I heard. Another pause. Then Virgil looked at him a little differently. Not like before. Not like 4 years ago. Something had shifted. You're not going to lowball them, he said. Not a question. Howard shook his head. No. Simple. I'll pay fair. And he meant it. That's the part that doesn't get talked about enough. He could have made a lot more money if he wanted to. Could have waited. Could have let auctions drive the price down even further. Could have picked up land for less than it was worth from men who didn't have a choice. Plenty of people would have. Some did, but Howard didn't. He knew what it felt like to stand on the edge of losing something like that. He wasn't going to be the man who took advantage of it just because he could. Virgil studied him for a second, then gave a slow nod. "All right," he said. "I'll help you with it." That's how it started. Not fast, not flashy, just one piece of land, then another. Always fair, always straight. By 1985, Howard Jessup was farming close to 800 acres, more than anyone else in Kingfisher County. Not because he set out to be the biggest, because he was the one who had been ready when things turned. But the land wasn't the most important part of what came next. It was what people started doing after they realized he'd been right. They came to him. At first just a few, then more. Farmers who had never asked him anything before now showed up at his place, stood at the edge of his fields, asked questions they should have asked years earlier. How deep do you plant it? When do you plant it? What do you watch for? What do you change? Howard didn't turn them away, didn't hold anything back. He showed them what he knew, walked them through it, explained what his grandfather had written, but in his own words now. Not as a warning anymore, as something real they could use. One afternoon, a man named Walt Driscoll sat across from him at the kitchen table, hat in his hands, turning it slowly like he was working up to something. "Why didn't you tell us?" he finally asked. "Back then, when you first figured it out, why didn't you just say it?" Howard didn't answer right away. He looked at him, not defensive, not surprised, just steady. "Would you have listened?" Walt opened his mouth, then closed it again, thought about it, then shook his head. "No, quiet, honest." Howard nodded once. "That's why. That was it. Not bitter, not angry, just true. People don't change when you tell them something might happen. They change when it's already happening and they can't ignore it anymore." His grandfather had understood that. That's why he wrote it down instead of trying to convince anyone at the time. That's why Howard planted instead of arguing. He showed it. And even then, it took 4 years in a drought for people to see it clearly. Over the next few years, things stabilized. Not the way they were before. Different. More careful. More aware. More willing to look at something that didn't follow the crowd right away. And Howard became something he never set out to be. Not just a farmer. A reference point. Someone people listened to when things didn't look right. Not because he was louder than anyone else. Because he had been willing to stand alone long enough to be proven right. In 1992, the County Historical Society asked if they could take the journal, put it somewhere people could see it, learn from it. Howard agreed. But before he handed it over, he sat down and added to it. Not much. Just a few pages. His own handwriting. His own years. He wrote about finding it in the attic, about the 4 seasons nobody believed him, about 1980, about what it cost to be early, and what it cost to be late. Then he ended it the same way his grandfather had, not trying to impress anyone, just writing what he knew to be true. The drought will come again. It always does. Maybe not soon, maybe not when you expect it, but it will come, and when it does, it won't matter what everyone else is doing. It will matter what you prepared for before it got there. He signed his name under it, closed the journal, and let it go. Howard Jessup died in 2001, 65 years old, worked his land almost to the end, didn't slow down much, didn't talk much about what he'd done either. The funeral was bigger than anyone expected. Farmers came in from outside the county, some from other states, men who had never met him, but had heard the story, had planted differently because of it, had held onto their land because of it. Tommy stood up to speak. Not a boy anymore. A man who had lived long enough to understand what his father had really done. He held the journal in his hands. The same one that had sat in that attic for 30 years before anyone opened it. "This book saved our family," he said. "Twice." He paused, looked out at the crowd. "First when my great-grandfather wrote it, then when my father listened." He closed it slowly. Both times, the man who carried it was called wrong. A few people shifted in their seats. Some nodded. They remembered. Both times he was right. That was all he needed to say. Today the land is still there, still being worked. 4th generation now. And every spring before anything gets planted, they sit down and read those same words again. Not because they don't remember, because they do. That's the whole point. You don't wait until things go bad to remember what matters. You remember before. That's the difference. That's the line most people miss. And if there's anything worth taking from a story like this, it's not about sorghum. It's not about wheat. It's not even about farming. It's about something simpler than that. There will always be a season when everything looks fine, when everyone is doing the same thing and it seems to be working. And there will always be a few signs that something isn't quite right yet. Easy to ignore, easy to explain away. Most people wait. That's what makes it feel safe. But safe and right aren't always the same thing. And by the time it's obvious, it's already after.